History is not always written by the strong. Sometimes it is written by the weak, or rather, by those who are masters of the art of looking weak. Imagine a cold, mist-heavy morning in December 1805. The rolling hills of Moravia are dusted with snow, and the air is so sharp it lungs. Here, on this nondescript patch of earth, the fate of the world is about to be decided. 3 emperors have brought their armies to a single point. On one side, the ancient weight of the Russian and Austrian empires, confident in their divine right and their overwhelming numbers. On the other, a man they dismissed as a Corsican upstart, a revolutionary general who had crowned himself Emperor of the French. Napoleon Bonaparte stood on the edge of a precipice, and he was smiling. He had done the unthinkable. He had committed what every military manual of the age called a cardinal sin. He had surrendered the high ground. He had looked at the Pratzen Heights, the most commanding position on the battlefield, and he had simply walked away from them. Even more baffling to his marshals, he had intentionally thinned his right flank until it looked like a fragile thread, a desperate invitation for the enemy to strike. He wanted the Allies to believe he was frightened. He wanted them to believe he was exhausted and preparing to flee. This was not just a battle, it was a grand theatrical trap, and the price of admission for the 2 emperors would be the lives of their finest soldiers and the very existence of the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire. This is the story of Austerlitz, the moment when a tactical lie became a geopolitical earthquake. This is the day Napoleon lured 2 empires into a death trap. By the winter of 1805, the French Empire was a titan under siege. While Napoleon's Grande Armée was arguably the most refined killing machine in Europe, it was surrounded. To the west, the British Royal Navy owned the seas, cutting off any hope of expansion or easy supply. To the east, the Third Coalition was rising like a tidal wave. The Russian Tsar, Alexander I, and the Austrian Emperor, Franz II, had combined their might. Their plan was brutal in its simplicity: use their massive numerical advantage to surround and crush the French. Tsar Alexander was young, handsome, and desperate for the kind of glory that would see him whispered about in the same breath as Alexander the Great. He was surrounded by young aristocrats who viewed Napoleon with a mixture of hatred and snobbery. To them, the French army was a rabble of enlightened peasants who had never faced the iron discipline of a true imperial line. They didn't see a genius. They saw a lucky gambler whose streak was about to end. Napoleon understood something they did not. He knew that an army is not just a collection of muskets and bayonets. It is a nervous system. It is a psychological entity. He knew he could not win a war of attrition against the combined weight of Russia and Austria. He needed a decisive blow, a wound so deep it would force the old world to its knees. To get it, he had to make the Allies feel invincible. He had to bait them into an attack so aggressive that it would leave them exposed. As the sun began to struggle against the thick Moravian fog on December 2nd, the trap was set. The Allies looked down from the Pratzen Heights and saw exactly what Napoleon wanted them to see: a French army that looked disorganized and dangerously overextended. Alexander I ignored the cautious advice of his veteran general Kutuzov, who sensed a trap. The Tsar saw the French right flank, the weak point, and gave the order. Thousands upon thousands of Russian and Austrian troops began to descend the heights. They were moving toward the village of Telmitz, aiming to cut off Napoleon's supposed line of retreat. They were certain the trap was closing on the French. In reality, the French right flank was a forced weakness. It was led by Marshal Davout, whose corps had just completed a staggering 70-mile march in 48 hours to reach the field. They were the anvil. They would hold the line at all costs, absorbing the massive Allied hammer blow. But while the Allies poured their strength into the valley, they did something fatal. To fuel their attack on the French right, they stripped their own center bare. They abandoned the very heights that gave them their advantage. Napoleon, standing in the valley below, hidden by the sun of Austerlitz and the lingering mist, watched as the Pratzen Heights became a ghost town of artillery and few defenders. He turned to his commanders. "How long will it take you to reach the summit?" he asked. Marshal Soult replied, "Less than 20 minutes, sire." Napoleon waited. He waited for the Allies to commit so fully to their flanking maneuver that they could not possibly turn back. "When the enemy is making a mistake," he famously remarked, "we must take care not to interrupt him." Then the order was given. The fog began to lift, and the sun of Austerlitz burst through, illuminating a sight that chilled the blood of the Allied commanders. Emerging from the mist, not in retreat, but in perfect, terrifying columns, were the veterans of Soult's 4th Corps. They weren't fleeing. They were charging straight into the heart of the Allied line. The impact was cataclysmic. The Allies on the heights were taken completely by surprise. The center of their army was no longer a line, it was a gap. The French surged onto the Pratzen, turning the Allied guns against their own retreating comrades. The Allied army was now physically sliced in two. The massive force that had descended into the valley to crush the French right now found itself trapped between Davout's iron defense and Soult's dominant position on the heights. The battlefield dissolved into a chaotic, bloody nightmare. Tsar Alexander tried to restore order, throwing his elite imperial guard into the fray. This was the moment of maximum tension, the clash of the giants. Russian horse guards hammered into French infantry. The ground shook with the impact of the finest cavalry in Europe. For a brief moment, the French center wavered. But Napoleon had kept his own guard in reserve for this exact moment. He unleashed them, and the Russian elite were shattered. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of Allied soldiers fled across the frozen Sachan ponds. In one of the most controversial and brutal moments of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire not at the men, but at the ice. The surface shattered, and the freezing water became a grave for those who had thought they were marching to a certain victory. By the time the sun set over the blood-stained snow, the map of Europe had been redrawn. The Austrian emperor sued for peace immediately. The Holy Roman Empire, an institution that had survived since the Middle Ages, was dissolved. Tsar Alexander retreated to Russia, his dreams of being a new Alexander the Great replaced by the bitter taste of defeat. Austerlitz was the masterpiece of a man who understood that the greatest weapon in war is the mind of your opponent. Napoleon hadn't just won a battle, he had inflicted a wound on the very concept of the old imperial order. He proved that genius, speed, and deception could overcome any amount of tradition and raw numbers. But as the smoke cleared, there was a darker truth. This victory was so perfect, so absolute, that it convinced Napoleon he was invincible. It gave him a sense of destiny that would eventually lead him to the burning ruins of Moscow and the muddy fields of Waterloo. The sun that rose at Austerlitz cast a long shadow, one that would eventually swallow the man who commanded it. The question remains for us, centuries later, was Austerlitz the pinnacle of military genius, or the beginning of a pride that no empire could survive? The emperor's wound was deep that day, but history shows us that wounds, even those inflicted by geniuses, eventually find a way to bleed the victor.